Hello readers, I'm the Avid Reader and today we're reviewing The Power of Geography, 10 Maps That Reveal the Future of Our World, written by Tim Marshall in 2021. So this is the sequel of Prisoners of Geography, written by Tim Marshall in 2015. In the previous book he analyzed great powers, very important countries and the regions of the world. In this book he looks more at medium-sized powers, so he doesn't look at a great power like China or the United States. He looks at more medium-level powers such as Iran and the United Kingdom. And in talking about each region or each country, it's mostly countries but some regions, he also brings up a lot of history of it. So it's also a bit of a history lesson on the area, but also a geography lesson, since he talks about the geography and he says that geography trumps everything else basically in global politics. It's the most important factor. It's not the only factor, but it's the main one. So this is in a sense a realist perspective, you could say. So there are 10 chapters, as I think in the previous book, and the first one is about Australia. And he talks about Australia's history, how it was colonized really recently, a couple hundred years ago, by Brits, and that it has, for most of its history, been Anglo-dominated. You pretty much only had Brits. But in the past century or so, or more and more in the past half century, you've had a lot of non-British Europeans and people from other countries coming there. And the indigenous people, they got the rights around the same times as blacks got the rights in the United States, so in the 60s or so. Because previously indigenous children were separated from their parents to be integrated into white society or whatever. So Australia has shifted from an Anglo culture to a multicultural one in a sense. Where it lies strategically, it has first relied on Britain, and then since World War II, so it has relied on the United States. It is a bit of an odd man out there, so you've got a Western liberal democracy among countries that are Asian, and you've got a big dictatorship bad guy of China. So Australia has to convince the United States that they are important to protect, to balance out against China. And the islands around Australia, such as Papua New Guinea, it's in Australia's interest to keep them protected, to make sure that China or someone else doesn't get control of them, because otherwise that could be a launching pad for an invasion on Australia. So that's mentioned several times. You've got islands off the coast, and if those islands are taken, then it can be a launching pad on the mainland. In large parts of Australia you cannot live, or not until recently. So mostly people live in the east coast, and you've got a bunch of big cities there, and then you got some people on the west coast. But in the land itself, barely nobody lives, so it would be actually pretty hard to take control of all of Australia because of its geography, since there's nothing in the middle. You've got a bunch of sand or barren deserts or whatever is there, and it's very hot, so yeah, good luck in conquering Australia. The second chapter is about Iran, so it talks about Persian history, and then with the Iranian Revolution, Tim Marshall has emphasized that Iran is a theocracy. So the Ayatollah has been elected by a bunch of Shia Muslim clerics, so it's a bit like the Pope, except that, unlike the Pope, the Ayatollah is supreme leader in his country. So first you had Ayatollah Khomeini, now you've got Ayatollah Khamenei, and he says that there's this type of fake democracy in Iran, kind of, where you've had some elections, but the candidates are handpicked. So I think if I understood it correctly, it's a bunch of people from the clergy who participate in elections. However, there are moderate candidates and then there are fundamentalist ones. So during the 2010s, you actually had the moderate faction winning and tried to open up relations with the West a bit, and through the Iran nuclear deals and things like that. And Iran has previously wanted to get nuclear weapons, might get them and things like that. But Iran is still an authoritarian regime. Protesters are beaten. Tim Marshall talks about his experience during the 2011 protests when Ahmadinejad was re-elected president falsely. So Iranian police chased him and threw stones at him. So you get a lot of personal stories from him in here, and it's a bit humorous sometimes, this book, British humor. So you've got the theocracy constraining the moderate faction, and there's discussion of will Iran unravel as a country, since there is a liberal class of people who don't like this Islamic fundamentalism. But the question is, will the youth overturn this or not? Because people put a lot of hope in the youth, but we must remember, all of Iran's social media propaganda and technology, that's developed by the youth, so it's unsure whether something will happen with that or not. Iran, as a medium-sized power, maintains relations with the Shia minorities in Sunni majority countries, in Islamic countries. So there are barely any Shia countries, but you've got large Shia minorities in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Azerbaijan, Bahrain, sometimes they're the majority, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon. So Iran has maintained a corridor throughout there to get access to the Mediterranean Sea. And the Iraq War, which overthrew Saddam Hussein, has now led to an Iranian Shia-friendly government in Iraq. So it's not a puppet state Iraq, but Iraq is happy to cooperate with Iran, and there are a bunch of Shia-backed militias in these different countries, including Iraq and Lebanon. Hezbollah, which is backed by Iran, is more powerful than the Lebanese army. The next chapter is on Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is an oil-rich nation, but dependence on Saudi Arabia for oil is decreasing in the West. I mean, the United States has now an oil surplus because of climate change and things like that. Demand for oil is going to decrease. Under the new leader, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, they have been reforming Saudi Arabia slowly. So it's an authoritarian absolute monarchy. And the foundation of Saudi Arabia is based on an alliance between the Sauds and the Wahhabis. The Sauds are the monarchy and the Wahhabis are the clergy. But only about 40% of Saudi Arabians are as radical as Wahhabi Muslims. So a lot of Saudi Arabia doesn't support this, and the Saudi tribe is a minority of Saudi Arabia. So we've got large minorities in Saudi Arabia that do not like to be ruled by Saudi Arabia, including Shia Muslims, so that's a problem. So under Mohammed bin Salman, they have been diversifying, but they have had some trouble. Remember, they whacked Khashoggi in the embassy in Turkey. That created some problems. They have been backing different military groups in some countries. They have had a rivalry with Turkey, for example. They have been allies with the United Arab Emirates. They are involved in the Yemen civil war, and because of realpolitik, of course, their human rights violations have been ignored because of the oil. But now this may change, so they have to think twice what they're gonna do, such as now having to give the right to drive to women. The fourth chapter is on the United Kingdom. So in the previous book, he talked about Brexit and how if a country was to leave the EU, it makes most sense for the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom, as an island, separate from the European continent, has always considered itself separate in a sense, and that has been reluctant to share sovereignty when joining the EU, and this is some things that fueled exiting the European Union. Also the 2008 financial crisis, they didn't like that. They've been paying more into the EU than they're getting back, so they kind of feel screwed in a deal. Now they're hoping to develop a special relationship with the United States, but that is dubious. But however, they are going to develop some relations with a lot of different countries now. And remember, not all of Europe is in the EU. They have relations with the Nordic countries that are out of the EU, and when they were trying to prevent some EU legislation, they made alliances with Central European and Eastern European nations. So the expansion of the European Union into the East was good to get more UK-leaning countries in accordance with their policy. So if the EU disintegrates, we'll see, but because of Russia, the Eastern Europe and Northern Europe may ally themselves with the United Kingdom, so we'll see if the United Kingdom can get some good trade deals. The biggest threat actually to the United Kingdom isn't outside invaders. I mean, they're an island separate, so that's really good, and their geography is in favor of them. Their biggest problem is the risk of disintegrating the United Kingdom, with Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland separating from them, as Scotland and Northern Ireland opposed Brexit. It will be bad for British geopolitics and this is because they've got some seaports there and they've got some nuclear weapons there. So one way to contain Russian aggression in the North Sea, for example, is through some bases in Scotland, but that is lost. And whether Scotland joins the EU or NATO, that's another question. I mean, they're more pacifist, I think, so it complicates things. The fifth chapter is on Greece. So Greece has been used to being conquered and screwed over by different countries. It became independent in the 1800s, but was still controlled by Brits and Russians and Turks and things like that. The Ottoman Empire collapsed slowly or faster and faster in the late 1800s. So Greece got bigger. You had the Greco-Turkish War, where Greece didn't succeed in getting some gains. Now there is competition in the Mediterranean Sea for some gas. they have a special relationship with Cyprus, as Cyprus is Greek majority ethnically, and then you've got the minority of Turks in the northeast, which is controlled by Turkey, occupied illegally. And Greece hopes to be the main power used by the West in the region now, since Greece is near a lot of strategic places such as the Bosphorus Strait, whatever that name is, the Black Sea, the Aegean Sea, Eastern Mediterranean. So, as Turkey is becoming more and more anti-Western and may slide out of NATO, this may be good for Greece. But they are competing with Turkey in that area. And Greece think it's unfair that they're getting all these migrants to their country and they're not quite developed yet, so it's a bit unfair. And their geography is a bunch of mountains, so they've had to rely on seaports or on places. Thus, they've had to maintain a large navy. The sixth chapter is Turkey, and Turkey had once a great Ottoman Empire. Then it collapsed, as I stated earlier. And then under Ataturk, they made sure that Turkey did not get too small, but they had problems handling the Kurds in the east. Always. There's a problem of the Armenian genocide, of course, which they have refused to ignore, so that cools relations between Turkey and the West. So Turkey was secular in the 20th century. Under Ataturk, that was the point. Modernization is westernization. And you've got these Istanbul liberal middle class guys who have run the country, but then you've got Erdogan who comes along in the early 2000s. And first, he's moving Turkey closer to the EU and trying to maintain soft power and friendly relations with everyone, but after the Arab Spring, he questions that. So he takes a different route of becoming more authoritarian. Turkey is becoming more authoritarian. Initially, he was pretty good on the Kurds, so the Kurds voted for him, but then the ceasefire broke with the PKK, who are terrorists in eastern Turkey but are Kurds and are fighting, so Turkey has a problem with them, so they've been oppressing Kurds again now. And you see the weird thing in realpolitik, because I think was it the Kurds in northern Iraq now or in Iran now that are helping the Turks oppressing the Kurds in Syria. So now Turkey controls de facto parts of northern Syria, and Turkish law is off the land there. You've had a bunch of more conservative rural people from Anatolia now moving into Istanbul. Well, the question is whether liberal Istanbul will now liberalize, make the people there more open-minded, the newcomers. So will Turkey become more and more backsliding democracy? I mean, Erdogan's mentality is democracy is like a bus stop. Once I'm done with it, I don't need it anymore. It's a bit like Iran. Will Turkey become more freer? It may one day, but now it's indicating to becoming more and more authoritarian. And there's a rivalry between Turkey and Egypt and Turkey and Saudi Arabia during the Arab Spring. Turkey liked the Muslim Brotherhood leader that was put in Egypt, and he didn't like the secular military dictator that it was put in afterwards as a coup. So Turkey has close connections with the Muslim Brotherhood, including Erdogan has. You've got a bunch of complicated cold wars in the Middle East. They're backing different people, for example, Libya. The seventh chapter is the Sahel. So the Sahel is a territory just under the Sahara Desert. It's a strip. I'm not sure really what it is, but it includes the countries just south of the Sahara Desert. And this is where you've got a hell of a lot of violence. You've got a bunch of Al-Qaeda cells there, and they are using the Tuareg minority, for example, in Mali. You've got ethnic groups that hate each other. There's the Tuareg ethnic groups that's not trusted, as they are Islamists who enjoy oppressing and imposing their vision of Islam strongly on others. So Africa has traditionally been more moderate Sufis in Islam, but now they're becoming more and more radical Salafists. So that's a problem. And France in West Africa has participated, has formed the G5 Sahel with a few African countries including Mali and Burkina Faso to prevent this terrorism. But it's expensive. In the last years, after Gaddafi was overthrown, you've got some Al-Qaeda guys who came down to West Africa and started killing a lot of people. You've got a bunch of terrorist attacks now in the region. It's horrible, it's brutal. And you don't realize how bad this thing is until you read about it. And the French are hoping to get assistance from the Americans and the Brits. And will the Chinese come in and the Russians? And if the French stop helping, then the Arabs, such as Saudi Arabia, or those in Asia may start helping. It's a war-torn area, that place. The 8th chapter is Ethiopia. So Ethiopia is the regional power in East Africa. So it was the only country that was not colonized in Africa in a sense. and you had the Emperor Selassie until you had a coup later on by the communist Mengistu. You had fighting between Somalia and Ethiopia. Ethiopia has a population of something like 110 million. They had control post World War II of Eritrea, but Eritrea separated in the early 90s. Ethiopia is described as a military dictatorship, but it seems that in 2018 things have gotten better under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, and he has emphasized that we are Ethiopians, not a collection of ethnic groups. So he has tried to make the ethnic-based nation into a federation, and there have been pushback from the different ethnic groups in Ethiopia. So he has to struggle with that, and then with terrorists along the Ethiopian border, you've got a bunch of provinces there that are more closely related to those in Somalia or Eritrea, for example. Ethiopia, they have some geographic advantages, such as they have control of the Nile River in a sense. They've been building dams, so now they can threaten Egypt with blocking the water supplies, and then they're gonna give a bunch of surplus water to Sudan. So the water in Ethiopia, it's blue gold being exchanged by black gold in other countries close by. So maybe Ethiopia will become a powerful state in Africa. And Egypt may go to war with Ethiopia if the dam situation becomes too bad. And remember, Ethiopia, it's landlocked. It's the biggest landlocked country in the world. But they are quite close to the Arab world, if you look at it geographically. The ninth chapter is Spain. So Spain has a geographical disadvantage, and this has regionalized the country for a long time. It's an old nation state for over 500 years, and they overthrew the Muslims a long time ago, although the Muslims were better than the Spaniards for a while in a sense. But anyways, you've had the geographical divisions, and because of this you've had strong regional nationalism. So you've got Catalonia, to a lesser extent Andalusia, you've got the Basque country that has committed terrorism, so there is not that strong sense of a Spanish identity everywhere in Spain. And Franco's solution to this, when he was the dictator in Spain for 40 years, was to suppress it as much as possible. And if you're in Spain, speak Spanish, you do not speak your local language. But since Spain has become democratic, they have given regional autonomy to these different areas, such as the Basque area or Catalonia. You had terrorism in the Basque area for a while under Franco. Now it has calmed down. The terrorist organization there has dissolved, actually disbanded. But in Catalonia, they've held a couple of referendums on independence, and it's been low turnout, but those who voted in the referendum always voted for strong Catalonian separation. The Catalonian parliament has voted for secession, but the Spain has sent in its police and locked things down and things like that. So it's precarious for the EU and Britain whether to support Catalonian independence or not, since if Catalonia is independent, will it go into the sphere of China, for example? So if you've got the Basque countries or Catalonia independent for Spain, that's bad, because now a trade route for them is blocked if those regions become unfriendly to them. So it's in geopolitical Spanish interest to keep them dependent on them, keep them in their reach. Spain has a lot of islands around them, far away, such as the Canary Islands. They've got some in the Mediterranean also. And I think it was Franco who declared that Spain is not European and never was, but Spain is becoming more and more European, and Spain has embraced the EU now. And the final chapter is about space. To summarize what he talks about there, it's a mix of, will you have realpolitik or cooperation? Let's hope for cooperation, but probably you will have realpolitik. This is a lot of science fiction of us imagining what may happen. You've got some private companies who are investing in things now, such as SpaceX, and the Chinese have landed something on the moon recently, and now you've got space exploration, and we'll see how far it gets, and if we can find a lot of resources that can be beneficial to the whole of humanity, or only to some countries and corporations. And that's the book in whole. So how would I rate The Power of Geography? I would give it an 8 out of 10. It's a strong 8, it's a good book, you learn a lot about geopolitics, and it's a supplement to Prisoners of Geography. So you read Prisoners of Geography to get the regions, and then you read this to see potential powers or how geography affects certain things. If you like history of some countries or the regions you want to learn about, You can read this book also, that's also interesting. You get to read about ethnic and religious tensions, how nations are dynamic. I could say that he's analyzing this from a neo-realist approach. So he believes that geography is prime in geopolitics, of course. So it's a lot of realism in this, but you've got some liberalism too. So it's neo-realism, and it's a well-balanced book. I mean, I recognized a couple comments here in this book. You've got Peter Frankopan and Darshina David praising this book, and both are good authors. So, an 8 out of 10. Definitely read this book if you're interested in geopolitics. It's pretty relevant. Read Prisoners of Geography first, and then read this as a supplement. This was the Avid Reader's review of The Power of Geography, 10 Maps That Reveal the Future of Our World, written by Tim Marshall in 2021. It got an 8 out of 10. I hope you readers enjoyed this book review, and I will see you readers next time.